In this video, we continue our discussion of the Gordon-Thurston settlement, and one of the key issues that Gordon and Thurston had to make decisions about in Fiji was land. How would land be managed and organised? How would disputes between settlers and indigenous Fijians be resolved? How could land be protected for indigenous Fijians? When Gordon became governor and arrived in Fiji, he was clear that he did not like the Deed of Cession because he had no part in drafting it. In particular, he was concerned about Clause 4 of the deed, which gave much of the inalienable land to the Crown. In effect, it meant that European settlers could acquire more land, and Gordon decided that this was a risk that he was not going to allow to happen. Instead, he argued in favour of returning land to the Italki. Between 1875 and 1880, he created a native land policy. Clause 4 was amended, and much of the land, which had originally been given to the Crown referring to Britain, much of this land was reverted to the Italki under the Council of Chiefs, which Gordon had invented. The amended clause read, "The absolute proprietorship of all lands not shown to be now alienated, so as to have become bona fide property of Europeans or other foreigners, or not now in actual occupation of some chief or tribe, or note actually required for the probable future, support and maintenance of some chief or tribe, shall be and is hereby declared to be vested in Her Majesty, her heirs, and successors." By amending this above clause, Gordon ensured that there were now three major land tenure types in Fiji. One was freehold land, land that could belong to Europeans and foreigners and could be purchased and sold. State land, which was land being the absolute property of the British Crown, and Italki land, native lands either in the actual use or occupation of some chief or tribe, or lands deemed necessary for the future use, support, and maintenance of chiefs and tribes. The intent of this clause in the deed is clear. Ownership of rights was clearly defined. Although small sections of unclaimed land or alienated land would still remain the property of the government or the British Crown, Gordon's quiet amendments to the clause gave much more land back to the Italki indigenous owners. This might explain why today approximately 90% of land in Fiji remains native land, or land that is the property of Italki. The next challenge for Gordon was how to determine ownership, how land should be registered and organised under the new British colony, and more importantly, how land could be taxed for government revenue. But before we look at those questions, let's think why Gordon and his successor Thurston promote the non-alienability of land. Why did they ensure that land could not be alienated or taken away from the indigenous owners? If we look at Gordon's own papers, he wrote that, quote, "The more the native polity is retained, native agency employed, avoid changes until naturally and spontaneously called for, the less likely natives would perish from the face of the earth." So we can take from this quote that Gordon was seriously concerned in the wake of the measles epidemic about the possible extinction of indigenous Fijians, and preserving their land under their own control was important in ensuring the continuation of their people. Gordon and his successor Thurston also believed that the integration of indigenous society would be upset by imposed changes under the British colony that could give much land to Europeans and foreigners. They believed that Indigenous Fijians needed time to adjust to the new system with minimal interruptions from outsiders. This would be important for later policies that ensured that Indigenous Fijians were treated separately from other migrant populations in Fiji and were protected or sheltered from major changes happening in the colony and globally. But this would have other unintended consequences, which we will discuss later. Now let's get to the next issue. How would land be registered, organised, and exchanged in this new colonial administration? On the 4th of March 1875, British Colonial Secretary Lord Henry Carnarvon instructed Gordon before he went to Fiji to devise a system of land administration with, quote, the view of disturbing as little as possible existing tenures, end quote. According to a source by historian Peter France, quote, the native system of tenure was held to be of immemorial origin and well known throughout Fiji, end quote. This quotation has been widely used to argue for the existence of an indigenous system of land holding that in the colonial minds had existed since time immemorial. This is a key assumption that would govern colonial attitudes to indigenous land in the coming decades. How did this arise? According to Derek Scarr, in 1874, the paramount object for evoking this notion was to keep European settlers at bay with any land claims. The common settler claim, as evident in Australia, was the land was terra nullius, the idea and legal concept that when the first Europeans arrived in Australia, the land was owned by no one, and therefore the land could be handed over to them for a pittance by the incoming colonial government. Gordon was likely well aware of the situation in Australia and how settlers had largely acquired large tracts of lands and ignored the wishes of the Indigenous Australians. Similarly, Gordon was aware of the case in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the problems that arose when land was not clearly registered or agreed upon with the Indigenous Maori tribes. And so, after Gordon created the Council of Chiefs, or the Bose Vakaturanga, one of the first things he asked them to do was to outline the traditionally recognised rights to land so that legislation could be framed to provide for a system of registration which would embody them. Essentially, before Gordon could create laws governing land in the new British colony of Fiji, he needed the chiefs to decide who was the basic land-owning unit. How was land allocated according to custom? First, Gordon created the Land Claims Ordinance of 1876. At the time of the colony, ordinances were essentially laws that were created by the British to help govern the colony of Fiji. And this Land Claims Ordinance gave rise to a body known as the Land Claims Commission. This was in response to settlers who wanted their own land claims recognised by the government and protected, but also Indigenous Fijians who claimed that their land had been stolen or taken illegally. The Land Claims Commission was tasked with investigating all land claims in Fiji and essentially solving all those disputes so that the government could move forward with significant land legislation in the future. One of the key issues that the Land Claims Commission was first tasked with was the issue of freehold land titles, also known as Crown grants. This was land that settlers had initially acquired and which Gordon was keen to ensure was given back to indigenous Fijians where possible. The Fiji National Archives holds the records of the proceedings of the Lands Claims Commission, where records of articles like whiskey, axes and guns were used to buy land. In some cases, these exchanges had happened before British colonial rule, but nonetheless, under the new British colony, they had to resolve these past disputes. This exercise was extremely complex. It took about 6 years. Different colonial officials, as well as indigenous translators, had to be sent around the colony of Fiji to record statements and testimonies from both settlers and indigenous tribes. But before this process could begin, one of the key issues facing Gordon and indigenous Fijians was what would be the unit of measurement to determine land-owning clans. And this was something that Gordon tasked the Native Council, also known as the Council of Chiefs, with deciding in 1877. If we look at the proceedings of the Native Council, which is held in the National Archives of Fiji, essentially meeting minutes, we can see that each vanua or group of people from around the colony of Fiji had different views and practices of land. There are many examples listed in these proceedings, but also observed by missionaries and settlers throughout the islands of Fiji, in which different tribes had different attitudes and practices towards land. The idea that everyone in Fiji had the same view of land and how it was managed or exchanged is not accurate. In actual fact, there was great diversity in views and approaches. Let's look at some of these examples that emerge from the proceedings of the Native Council. In the proceedings, it was very clear at the beginning of the discussion there was no uniform land tenure system in Fiji. Even some of the chiefs were unsure about the notion of time immemorial, because in some cases land could be given away or exchanged. It did not always belong for eternity or time immemorial to one particular group. The Vanua Levu Turanga, with the title of Tui Bua, said the confused nature of rights to land in Bua was the main reason why his people neglected to plant coconuts and fruit trees. And in 1876, he suggested the best way to settle the matter for the future was to divide the land among the people individually so that each man might plant for himself. This is quite an unusual notion at the time, the idea that land could be held individually rather than by a group, and this was something that one chief in Bua suggested in 1876. There are also examples from eastern Laos. Ma'afu supported the Tui Bua's views and pointed out that his system of land tenure in Laos was working well. According to the historian Peter France, Ma'afu's system in Laos was based on individual holdings, so that each person could work according to their own individual needs. Another issue in which different Vanua had different views was that of land alienation. Evidence before the Lands Claims Commission showed land alienation was common before Europeans arrived, as well as afterwards. Before Europeans arrived, land could be given by chiefs to different individuals for services rendered. It could also be given as a dowry based on claims of vasu relations or maternal relations through marriage. Social units could alienate tracts of land as a result of friendly intercourse or as allies in war. The Tui Thakau was notorious for land sales without consulting, and he often sold land as a way of preventing other competing chiefs like Ma'afu from acquiring it. So we see very different practices and approaches to land tenure in pre-colonial Fiji.